The Constitution of Liberty Summary. By Friedrich A. Hayek. Narrated by Saurav Chakraborty. The Constitution of Liberty, 1960, is a classic of economic philosophy. As one of the seminal texts of modern liberalism, it reminds us of the values of individual freedom, limited government, and universal principles of law. First published in the 1960s, it contends that social progress depends on the free market rather than on socialist planning. This work remains relevant in an age where socialist ideas are gaining new popularity. Introduction. What was the road by which we reached our position? What the form of government under which our greatness grew? What the national habits out of which it sprang? If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. The freedom which we enjoy in our government extends also to our ordinary life. But all this ease in our private relations does not make us lawless as citizens. Against this fear is our chief safeguard, teaching us to obey the magistrates and the laws, particularly such as regard the protection of the injured, whether they are actually on the statute book, or belong to that code which, although unwritten, yet cannot be broken without acknowledged disgrace. Pericles. If old truths are to retain their hold on men's minds, they must be restated in the language and concepts of successive generations. What at one time are their most effective expressions gradually become so worn with use that they cease to carry a definite meaning. The underlying ideas may be as valid as ever, but the words, even when they refer to problems that are still with us, no longer convey the same conviction. The arguments do not move in a context familiar to us, and they rarely give us direct answers to the questions we are asking. This may be inevitable because no statement of an ideal that is likely to sway men's minds can be complete. It must be adapted to a given climate of opinion, presuppose much that is accepted by all men of the time, and illustrate general principles in terms of issues with which they are concerned. It has been a long time since that ideal of freedom which inspired modern Western civilization, and whose partial realization made possible the achievements of that civilization, was effectively restated. In fact, for almost a century the basic principles on which this civilization was built have been falling into increasing disregard and oblivion. Men have sought for alternative social orders more often than they have tried to improve their understanding or use of the underlying principles of our civilization. It is only since we were confronted with an altogether different system that we have discovered that we have lost any clear conception of our aims and possess no firm principles which we can hold up against the dogmatic ideology of our antagonists. In the struggle for the moral support of the people of the world, the lack of firm beliefs puts the West at a great disadvantage. The mood of its intellectual leaders has long been characterized by disillusionment with its principles, disparagement of its achievements, and exclusive concern with the creation of better worlds. This is not a mood in which we can hope to gain followers. If we are to succeed in the great struggle of ideas that is underway, we must first of all know what we believe. We must also become clear in our own minds as to what it is that we want to preserve if we are to prevent ourselves from drifting. No less is an explicit statement of our ideals necessary in our relations with other peoples. Foreign policy today is largely a question of which political philosophy is to triumph over another, and our very survival may depend on our ability to rally a sufficiently strong part of the world behind a common ideal. This we shall have to do under very unfavorable conditions. A large part of the people of the world borrowed from Western civilization and adopted Western ideals at a time when the West had become unsure of itself, and had largely lost faith in the traditions that have made it what it is. This was a time when the intellectuals of the West had to a great extent abandoned the very belief in freedom which, by enabling the West to make full use of those forces that are responsible for the growth of all civilization, had made its unprecedented quick growth possible. In consequence, those men from the less advanced nations who became purveyors of ideas to their own people learned, during their Western training, not how the West had built up its civilization, but mostly those dreams of alternatives which its very success had engendered. This development is especially tragic because, though the beliefs on which these disciples of the West are acting may enable their countries to copy more quickly a few of the achievements of the West, they will also prevent them from making their own distinct contribution. Not all that is the result of the historical development of the West can or should be transplanted to other cultural foundations, and whatever kind of civilization will in the end emerge in those parts under Western influence may sooner take appropriate forms if allowed to grow rather than if it is imposed from above. If it is true, as is sometimes objected, that the necessary condition for a free evolution, the spirit of individual individual initiative is lacking, then surely without that spirit no viable civilization can grow anywhere. So far as it is really lacking, the first task must be to awaken it, and this a regime of freedom will do, but a system of regimentation will not. So far as the West is concerned, we must hope that here there still exists wide consent on certain one fundamental values. But this agreement is no longer explicit, and if these values are to regain power, a comprehensive restatement and revindication are urgently needed. There seems to exist no work that gives a full account of the whole philosophy on which a consistent liberal view can rest, no work to which a person wishing to comprehend its ideals may turn. We have a number of admirable historical accounts of how the political traditions of the West grew. But though they may tell us that the object of most Western thinkers has been to establish a society in which every individual, with a minimum dependence on discretionary authority of his rulers, would enjoy the privileges and responsibility of determining his own conduct within a previously defined framework of rights and duties, I know of none that explains what this means when applied to the concrete problems of our time, or whereupon the ultimate justification of this idea rests. In recent years valiant efforts have also been made to clear away the confusions which have long prevailed regarding the principles of the economic policy of a free society. I do not wish to underrate the clarification that has been achieved. Yet, though I still regard myself as mainly an economist, I have come to feel more and more that the answers to many of the pressing social questions of our time are to be found ultimately in the recognition of principles that lie outside the scope of technical economics, or of any other single discipline. Though it was from an original concern with problems of economic policy that I started, I have been slowly led to the ambitious and perhaps presumptuous task of approaching them through a comprehensive restatement of the basic principles of a philosophy of freedom. But I tender no apologies for thus venturing far beyond the range where I can claim to have mastered all the technical detail. If we are to regain a coherent conception of our aims, similar attempts should probably be made more often. One thing, in fact, which the work on this book has taught me is that our freedom is threatened in many fields, because of the fact that we are much too ready to leave the decision to the expert, or to accept too uncritically his opinion about a problem of which he knows intimately only one little aspect. But since the matter of the ever-recurring conflict between the economist and the other specialists will repeatedly come up in this book, I want to make it quite clear here that the economist cannot claim special knowledge which qualifies him to coordinate the efforts of all the other specialists. What he may claim is that his professional occupation with the prevailing conflicts of aims has made him more aware than others of the fact that no human mind can comprehend all the knowledge which guides the actions of society, and of the consequent need for an impersonal mechanism, not dependent on individual human judgments, which will coordinate the individual efforts. It is his concern with the impersonal processes of society in which more knowledge is utilized than any one individual or organized group of human beings can possess that puts the economists in constant opposition to the ambitions of other specialists who demand powers of control because they feel that their particular knowledge is not given sufficient consideration. In one respect this book is, at the same time, more and less ambitious than the reader will expect. It is not chiefly concerned with the problems of any particular country, or of a particular moment of time but, at least in its earlier parts, with principles which claim universal validity. The book owes its conception and plan to the recognition that the same intellectual trends, under different names or disguises, have undermined the belief in liberty throughout the world. If we want to counter these trends effectively, we must understand the common elements underlying all their manifestations. We must also remember that the tradition of liberty is not the exclusive creation of any single country, and that no nation has sole possession of the secret even today. My main concern is not with the particular institutions or policies of the United States or of Great Britain, but with the principles that these countries have developed on foundations provided by the ancient Greeks, the Italians of the early Renaissance, and the Dutch, and to which the French and the Germans have made important contributions. Also, my aim will not be to provide a detailed program of policy, but rather to state the criteria by which particular measures must be judged if they are to fit into a regime of freedom. It would be contrary to the whole spirit of this book if I were to consider myself competent to design a comprehensive program of policy. Such a program, after all, must grow out of the application of a common philosophy to the problems of the day. While it is not possible to describe an ideal adequately without constantly contrasting it with others, my aim is not mainly critica. My intention is to open doors for future development rather than to bar others, or, I should perhaps say, to prevent any such doors being barred, as invariably happens when the state takes sole control of certain developments. My emphasis is on the positive task of improving our institutions, and if I can do no more than indicate desirable directions of development, I have at any rate tried to be less concerned with the brushwood to be cleared away than with the roads which should be opened. As a statement of general principles, the book must deal mainly with basic issues of political philosophy, but it approaches more tangible problems as it proceeds. Of its 3 parts, the first endeavors to show why we want liberty and what it does. This involves some examination of the factors which determine the growth of all civilizations. The discussion in this part must be mainly theoretical and philosophical, if the latter is the right word to describe the field where political theory, ethics, and anthropology meet. It is followed by an examination of the institutions that Western man has developed to secure individual liberty. We enter here the field of jurisprudence, and shall approach its problems historically. Yet it is neither from the point of view of the lawyer nor from that of the historian that we shall chiefly regard that evolution. Our concern will be with the growth of an ideal, only dimly seen and imperfectly realized at most times, which still needs further clarification if it is to serve as a guide for the solution of the problems of our times. In the third part of the book, those principles will be tested by the application of them to some of today's critical economic and social issues. The topics I have selected are in those areas where a false choice among the possibilities before us is most likely to endanger freedom. Their discussion is meant to illustrate how often the pursuit of the same goals by different methods may either enhance or destroy liberty. They are mostly the kind of topics on which technical economics alone does not provide us with sufficient guidance to formulate a policy, and which can be adequately treated only within a wider framework. But the complex issues which each of them raises can, of course, not be treated exhaustively in this volume. Their discussion serves mainly as an illustration of what is the chief aim of this book, namely, the interweaving of the philosophy, jurisprudence, and economics of freedom which is still needed. This book is meant to help understanding, not to fire enthusiasm. Though in writing about liberty the temptation to appeal to emotion is often irresistible, I have endeavored to conduct the discussion in as sober a spirit as possible. Though the sentiments which are expressed in such terms as the dignity of man and the beauty of liberty are noble and praiseworthy, they can have no place in an attempt at rational persuasion. I am aware of the danger of such a cold-blooded and purely intellectual approach to an ideal which has been a sacred emotion to many and which has been stoutly defended by many more to whom it never constituted an intellectual problem. I do not think the cause of liberty will prevail unless our emotions are aroused. But though the strong instincts on which the struggle for liberty has always nourished itself are an indispensable support, they are neither a safe guide nor a certain protection against error. The same noble sentiments have been mobilized in the service of greatly perverted aims. Still more important, the arguments that have undermined liberty belong mainly to the intellectual sphere, and we must therefore counter them here. Some readers will perhaps be disturbed by the impression that I do not take the value of individual liberty as an indisputable ethical presupposition, and that, in trying to demonstrate its value, I am possibly making the argument in its support a matter of expediency. This would be a misunderstanding. But it is true that if we want to convince those who do not already share our moral suppositions, we must not simply take them for granted. We must show that liberty is not merely one particular value, but that it is the source and condition of most moral values. What a free society offers to the individual is much more than what he would be able to do if only he were free. We can therefore not fully appreciate the value of freedom until we know how a society of free men as a whole differs from one in which unfreedom prevails. I must also warn the reader not to expect the discussion to reintroduction main always on the plane of high ideals or spiritual values. Liberty in practice depends on very prosaic matters, and those anxious to preserve it must prove their devotion by their attention to the mundane concerns of public life and by the efforts they are prepared to give to the understanding of issues that the idealist is often inclined to treat as common, if not sordid. The intellectual leaders in the movement for liberty have all too often confined their attention to those uses of liberty closest to their hearts, and have made little effort to comprehend the significance of those restrictions of liberty which did not directly affect them. If the main body of the discussion is to be as matter of fact and unemotional as possible throughout, its starting point will of necessity have to be even more pedestrian. The meaning of some of the indispensable words has become so vague that it is essential that we should at the outset agree on the sense in which we shall use them. The words freedom and liberty have been the worst sufferers. They have been abused and their meaning distorted until it could be said that the word liberty means nothing until it is given specific content, and with a little massage it will take any content to legate. We shall therefore have to begin by explaining what this liberty is that we are concerned with. The definition will not be precise until we have also examined such other almost equally vague terms as coercion, arbitrariness, and law which are indispensable in a discussion of liberty. the analysis of. These concepts has, however, been postponed to the beginning of, so that the arid effort at clarification of words should not present too great an obstacle before we reach the more substantial issues. For this attempt at restating a philosophy of men's living together which has slowly developed through more than 2,000 years, I have drawn encouragement from the fact that it has often emerged from adversity with renewed strength. During the last few generations it has gone through one of its periods of decline. If to some, especially those in Europe, this book should appear to be a kind of inquest into the rationale of a system that no longer exists, the answer is that if our civilization is not to decline, that system must be revived. Its underlying philosophy became stationary when it was most influential, as it had often progressed when on the defensive. It has certainly made little progress during the last 100 years, and is now on the defensive. Yet the very attacks on it have shown us where it is vulnerable in its traditional form. One need not be wiser than the great thinkers of the past to be in a better position to comprehend the essential conditions of individual liberty. The experience of the last 100 years has taught us much that a Madison or a Mill, a Tocqueville or a Humboldt could not perceive. Whether the moment has arrived when this tradition can be revived will depend not only on our success in improving it, but also on the temper of our generation. It was rejected at a time when men would recognize no limits to their ambition, because it is a modest and even humble creed, based on a low opinion of men's wisdom and capacities, and aware that, within the range for which we can plan, even the best society will not satisfy all our desires. It is as remote from perfectionism as it is from the hurry and impatience of the passionate reformer, whose indignation about particular evils so often blinds him to the harm and injustice that the realization of his plans is likely to produce. Ambition, impatience, and hurry are often admirable in individuals, but they are pernicious if they guide the power of coercion, and if improvement depends on those who, when authority is conferred on them, assume that in their authority lies superior wisdom, and thus the right to impose their beliefs on others. I hope our generation may have learned that it has been perfectionism of one kind or another that has often destroyed whatever degree of decency societies have achieved. With more limited objectives, more patience, and more humility, we may in fact advance further and faster than we have done while under the guidance of a proud and most presumptuous confidence in the transcendent wisdom of this age and its discernment. Individual liberty is the cornerstone of a free society. Freedom has always been a guiding principle of Western civilization. It's a philosophy that was outlined by the ancient Greeks and refined centuries later by Enlightenment philosophers like Rousseau, Locke, and Hume. The value of freedom still guides our thinking today. But are we doing enough to protect it? The author's answer is a resounding no. He believes that Western politics are moving away from this fundamental value, and that we must do better. Here's the key message: individual liberty is the cornerstone of a free society. What does the idea of freedom even mean? Well, for the author, it mainly refers to individual liberty. In this context, free people are those who make their own decisions without any external coercion. Individual liberty, then, is more of a freedom from than a freedom to. In other words, nobody can tell us which of life's many paths to choose. But this doesn't mean that we can follow any path we like. Our choices will always remain limited. For example, our physical, intellectual, or economic abilities may prevent us from pursuing certain careers. But that's different from coercion, outside pressure that happens when other people control our minds, bodies, or even environments in order to make us act in a certain way. Coercion robs us of alternatives and devalues us as thinking individuals. There will probably never be a world without coercion. Our social, economic, and political relations to other people are too complex for that. Just think about how we have to submit to others' demands or expectations if we depend on their services. This means that liberty is, ultimately, just an ideal. But we should strive for it and work to achieve the highest degree of liberty possible. In a free society, only the government has the explicit power of coercion. And it only uses that power to shield us from people who are encroaching on our freedom, for instance, by punishing lawbreakers. Just keep in mind that individual liberty is the key value of a free society. Key ideas. Individual liberty is the cornerstone of a free society. Liberty, equality, and democracy are connected, but they're not the same. Social progress depends on individual liberty. A free society should be guided by the rule of law. The socialist doctrine threatens individual liberty. The government should steer clear of progressive taxation. The government can offer a certain level of social security. Ultimately, though, people should provide for themselves. Government interference should be kept to a minimum,